subscribe and tap the bell right now. Twice a day, we bring you the real code of the samurai, not paraphrased, never softened. In the early 1700s, a former samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo sat in a mountain hermitage, having shaved his head and become a Buddhist monk after the death of his lord. He wanted, by every account, to follow that lord into death himself, a practice called junsha, where a retainer took his own life to accompany his master into whatever came after. The shogunate had banned junsha outright by this point in Japanese history, precisely because too many genuinely capable men had been dying in service of a symbolic gesture rather than continuing to serve their domains in more useful, practical ways. So Tsunetomo found another outlet instead. Over roughly 7 long years, a younger samurai named Toshiro Tsurumoto regularly visited him and carefully wrote down everything he said, reflections on a warrior's code from a man who'd lived out his entire career during Japan's long, settled peace, and never once had to actually test any of it in a real battle. Those recorded conversations became Hagakure, a title usually rendered as something like hidden among the leaves, and the result is one of the most unusual and uncompromising texts to come out of the entire samurai tradition. Hagakure's central idea is blunt, almost to the point of shock, for a reader encountering it for the first time centuries later and an ocean away. A samurai should approach every single day already having accepted his own death. Not as morbid resignation, and not as despair, as a specific, practical discipline. Tsunetomo argued that a warrior who has genuinely made peace with dying, freshly, every single morning, before anything has actually threatened him, is the only warrior truly capable of acting with total freedom for the rest of that day. Left completely unexamined, fear of death quietly narrows nearly every decision a person makes. What risks feel acceptable, what confrontations feel worth having, what truths feel safe enough to say out loud. Tsunetomo's answer wasn't to manage that fear. It was to remove its power entirely, by deciding the worst outcome in advance and refusing to let it quietly govern anything that comes afterward. This connects directly to the deeper discipline running through all of samurai mental training, which we covered in an earlier video, rehearsing the worst outcome deliberately, in a calm moment, so it can't ambush you in a moment that isn't calm. Hagakure takes that same principle and pushes it further than almost any other text in the tradition, applying it not occasionally, as a mental exercise, but as the starting condition for literally every day. Tsunetomo wasn't describing a technique to use before a duel. He was describing a permanent posture toward being alive at all. It's worth being honest, before going any further, about what makes Hagakure controversial, and why it sat largely unread outside a small circle for roughly 2 centuries after it was first written down. Tsunetomo's own lord had explicitly disapproved of the text and asked that it not be widely circulated, and for most of the Edo period it remained a private teaching passed among a small circle rather than a famous book. That changed dramatically in the 20th century, when the text was rediscovered and, during Japan's militarist period leading into and through the Second World War, selectively promoted and distorted to glorify suicidal combat and unquestioning obedience to the state, used Tsunetomo, writing 2 centuries earlier about personal composure and daily readiness rather than national sacrifice on an industrial scale, almost certainly never intended and likely could not have foreseen. That history is part of the honest record around this text, and it's worth knowing before treating any individual line as a simple, uncomplicated life lesson. Read past that later distortion, though, and it's worth making the effort to. What Tsunetomo actually recorded across those 7 years of conversation is closer to a demanding personal discipline than anything resembling a political doctrine. He talks at length about small, ordinary matters, how to carry yourself in conversation, how to serve a lord competently even in an era with no wars left to fight, how to avoid the specific kind of cowardice that shows up not on a battlefield but in everyday hesitation, excuse-making, and the quiet abandonment of standards nobody else is watching closely enough to notice. Hagakure's death acceptance isn't really about death at all, in the end. It's a lens for examining whether you're living, today, in a way you'd actually be willing to stand behind if today turned out to be the last one you got. There's a specific mechanism worth pulling out of Tsunetomo's teaching, because it explains why this discipline actually works rather than just sounding grim. Most hesitation, examine honestly, isn't really about the action itself, it's about a vague, unexamined fear of some downstream consequence the mind never actually forces itself to name precisely. Tsunetomo's method forces that naming. If you've already accepted the single largest possible consequence, death itself, as a settled fact rather than a looming threat, then every smaller consequence beneath it, embarrassment, rejection, professional risk, and uncomfortable conversation, loses the outsized power it had when death was still an unexamined shadow behind it. This is closer to a deliberate recalibration of scale than a fatalistic shrug. Once the largest fear on the list has been faced directly and stripped of its power, everything smaller than it becomes, almost automatically, easier to face as well. This is also why Hagakure spends so much of its actual text on unglamorous, everyday conduct rather than dramatic battlefield scenarios its author never personally experienced. Tsunetomo served an entire career during Japan's long Edo peace, handling administrative duties, court etiquette, and the ordinary friction of serving a lord with no war left to fight, and he treated the discipline of facing death daily as directly relevant to all of it, not reserved for some hypothetical future battle. A clerk who has genuinely made peace with the worst thing that could happen to him carries a different kind of composure into an ordinary difficult meeting than one who hasn't, even though no sword is anywhere near either room. That's also why the text still gets read seriously, stripped of its worst later misuse, because the core discipline it demands, deciding, in advance and without flinching, exactly what you'd regret not doing if this were your only remaining chance to do it, doesn't require a sword, a lord, or a battlefield to be worth practicing. It only requires being honest about how much of ordinary hesitation actually comes from an unexamined fear of consequences that, held up to the light Tsunetomo insisted on, usually turn out considerably smaller than the daily, compounding cost of avoiding them indefinitely. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Twice a day, we bring you Bushido straight from the source, the real words of the man who wrote the code down, and the real warriors who lived it.